Hello, this is Karl-James Langford on channel 01 to 1975. The last 2 weeks I've been looking specifically at the evidence for timber in archaeology and what remains, the archaeology above the surface. So what we're going to start off with is a few images care of University of Leicester when I was a student there, and then we'll develop these and ground to images of archaeology and the timber evidence that has actually survived in the ground. So this is a two-pronged approach, and this is something I've been looking at for 2 whole weeks with my students. So the first image is the typical image that I've been examining with my students. Structures from the 1400s onwards in medieval England, Wales and Scotland. These crux frame structures were structures that started to originate in form and stature from very early on. We see evidence of crux frame structures surviving predominantly from the 1400s onwards, but we do see examples, for example, in York from the 1200s. Basically, a crux frame structure is where you use 2 complete timbers, and they create 2 of the main frame elements of a building. So you might have 4 trees creating 2 gable ends of a structure, which would be technically 1 bay. As you can see with this next image, this is to be seen as a single bay, where you've got 2 sets of frames creating this structure. One thing I didn't want to do with this lecture is make it very boring for people watching and listening. So what I want us to do is get onto the nitty-gritty of the archaeology. But before we get onto that, I want to show you the types of structures that develop from the crux frame structures, and looking at some of these jetting out buildings that you actually see dominating places like York, Cheshire, Shrewsbury and elsewhere in Britain. Looking at some more of these images takes us to cross sections of various different ways that you would cut the timber in medieval Britain to create some of the forms of buildings that we will actually see preserved in the archaeology in the ground. This is an upstanding structure that shows in colour the way the crux frame was used. This building itself, you can see a number of bays. Each of these bays is formed by 2 trees. When we think of timber in archaeology surviving in the ground in a very good state of preservation, we always think of ship timbers. So ship timbers from the 1700s, found in the muds and the estuaries around the British coast and in many other parts of the world. Usually when we think about timber being found in archaeology, we just look at the tools that we find and not actually the timber. When you go into archaeology initially, you don't expect ever to find timber. But timber itself has a remarkable way of surviving, and surviving in such a state that it can outlive, in a number of areas, brick, because that deteriorates as well, and the stone. When archaeologists do excavate, they actually see traces of timber in the ground. You can see on this Roman site where you have traces of Roman wall, large pits for the post holes which have not been destroyed via ploughing, and stayed in the ground where the crux frame of some of these buildings were placed in a medieval period. So we've got 3 phases here: prehistoric phase of the post holes, Roman phase, we've got a medieval phase. Some people can find archaeology above ground that's been reused. This is an example in the Al-Aqsa Mosque where timbers have been reused in the structure. So we can see earlier structures being reused which can't be said for brick, where brick is just completely discarded. Lots of stone can be reused, but when it's been badly damaged it can't be reused, but timber can be used in many different forms. Archaeologists, when you look at this image, you can find that the stonework has been completely ploughed out at this Roman site, but the post holes marked by their staining and form in the ground show you that there was a building there, and this was too deep to be destroyed by ploughing, so an advantage over brick and stonework. You can see unusual sites in archaeology, such as this site in Sweden, where post holes are formed in rows and the staining is to be seen in the ground. If you had a stone example or brick example, the material would be completely looted, showing very few signs in the archaeology. But as we gradually start to see in archaeology, this is Magnus Magnusson at the site of Coppergate, now known as the Ovik Viking Centre. A site of great value was being excavated in the 1970s and now displayed as one of the examples of timber work being displayed in a great form in Britain from 1200 years ago. These images show the very well preserved timbers at Coppergate, and also you see wonderful reconstructions made of the archaeology that was in such a good state of preservation, not much was left to imagination. Archaeologists don't only find timber from the Viking period, but you can also learn great clues to the evidence from the Roman period in Britain, with timbers from the River Thames, or the banks of the former River Thames in London. Very well preserved. Details that tell you of the trees being used, what the conditions were like at the time, skills of the craftsman, and so on. Many advantages over brick and stone, which tell, I feel, a very flat story compared with timber. Other excavations at York from, say, Hungate show us of other timbers. More and more timbers are being found in waterlogged conditions like York and London, and much more is being found in London again, the Bloomberg site, where you get quay timbers being formed along the River Thames and quays and embankments being formed along the River Thames. We usually reuse timbers from former buildings, which can tell us of other uses in the city other than the final resting place of the timbers, and many can be seen in a very good state of preservation. Moving a little bit further on here, in Dublin, for example, they'd be finding evidence of Viking occupation from 1200 years ago. Some of the wattled walls of these structures standing up to 1 metre, 2 metres in height today, very similar to the preservation evidence seen at Jorvik. But the evidence from timber in archaeology doesn't stretch only to the Roman and Viking periods. The only evidence from earlier periods of occupation in Britain, for example, can be seen from the site of Flixton near Starcar in Scarborough in north-eastern England. Evidence of one of the oldest houses found anywhere in Britain, if not Europe. It's found dating back to 10,500 years ago. Evidence in a very good state of preservation. If we didn't have this evidence, we wouldn't have any real evidence of their homes, because they really didn't build out of timber. They really didn't build out of stone, and certainly didn't build out of brick. I love these images of the Flixton site and another reconstruction here. Timber itself is a material that can be used to tell us a great deal in archaeology. The carpenter's skills, timbers have been reused, trees, landscape, basic civilization. Timbers don't only tell us about land sites, but can tell us about sites that are to be found on many of our lakes, crannog sites in Britain. Hope you've enjoyed this video log about my teachings to my students over the past 2 weeks. Thank you very much.